The sea was black enough to erase distance. No moon, no coastline, no horizon you could trust. Only the weight of humid Pacific night pressing down over steel decks, signal lamps, bridge glass, and the men straining their eyes into emptiness. The kind of darkness Japanese naval officers had been taught to master. The kind of darkness in which training, nerve, and discipline could still decide everything. On the bridge of a Japanese destroyer, the captain stood with the calm posture expected of him, one hand near the rail, the other resting close to the chart table behind him. Beneath his boots, the ship trembled with the rhythm of engines driving hard through warm water. Around him, lookouts scanned the void with binoculars that had once seemed like an extension of the human body itself. In this world, vision was not simply seeing, it was instinct, it was profession, it was survival. And yet, something felt wrong. Not because enemy ships had been sighted. That would have made sense. Not because shells had already fallen. That too would have made sense. But because the silence itself had changed. Reports came up from the watch in fragments. A flash to port, no confirmation. A possible wake, no bearing fixed. A shape seen and then lost. Men were peering, adjusting, listening for signs that normally came before battle. Searchlights, muzzle flashes, the distinctive confusion of ships stumbling into one another in darkness. Instead, what came first was accuracy. A column of water erupted astern, white in the dark. Then another, closer, then a third, walking toward the formation with the cold precision of an unseen hand measuring range. Someone on the bridge shouted a bearing. Another officer demanded confirmation. The captain turned, trying to judge from flash and sound where the firing ship must be. But that was the problem. There was no visible enemy. The shells were not wild guesses thrown into the night. They were deliberate, adjusted, correcting, closing. Then torpedoes were reported, not with certainty. At first, only with that dreadful tone sailors used when they were no longer reporting what they knew, but what they feared might already be true. A lookout cried out that he saw wakes crossing the dark surface ahead. Helm orders snapped across the bridge. Signalmen fumbled with lamps. Engines were ordered over. Formation began to flex under the strain of sudden maneuver. In darkness, that alone could become its own danger. One ship avoiding torpedoes could disrupt the spacing of every ship behind it. The neat lines of doctrine could become a trap of steel and momentum. Now the captain understood something he did not yet have words for. The Americans were not just firing into the night. They were seeing through it. For years, Japanese officers had been taught that the night sea could be mastered by the better sailor. Darkness hid movement. It magnified skill. It rewarded confidence, aggression, and discipline. In daylight, America's industrial weight and heavy gunpowder could be terrifying. At night, many Japanese commanders believed those advantages could be narrowed, even neutralized. A well-trained force moving fast and striking first with torpedoes could tear apart a stronger enemy before that enemy fully understood the danger. That belief had not come from arrogance alone. It had come from preparation, doctrine, and results. But in this moment, under invisible fire from ships that seemed to know where to shoot before they were seen, another reality was emerging. The old balance between courage and uncertainty was beginning to collapse. Imagine standing on that bridge. Imagine hearing shells before you see their splashes. Sensing that somewhere beyond the black line of the sea, another commander already has your range, your course, perhaps even your intention. You are not simply in danger. You are already known. That is a different kind of fear. A gun can kill you, but first it must find you. If the finding has already happened, then the battle has begun before your mind has caught up. The deck shook again. Another salvo. One cruiser farther down the line answered with its own guns, flashing orange for an instant and giving the whole formation a brief, terrible silhouette. For a heartbeat, ship shapes leapt out of darkness, only to vanish again. And in that brief illumination, there was an awful truth. They were revealing themselves while firing at an enemy who did not need to reveal itself in return. The captain's training told him to regain the initiative. Turn, Launch, close the range, force the action into something human and direct. But every second spent trying to recover the battle was a second the enemy already seemed to own. Reports from the lower bridge came too slowly. Bearings shifted. The invisible geometry of the night had been stolen from him. Every instinct that had once made him feel dangerous now made him feel late. The Pacific campaign was full of explosions, smoke, and violence, but this was the deeper transformation hidden beneath them. Not merely ships being sunk, not merely weapons becoming deadlier. It was the death of a belief, the belief that darkness still belonged equally to both sides. Long before many Japanese captains fully feared American naval gunfire, they began to fear what made that gunfire possible. The invisible detection, the calm plotting, the electronic contact unseen by the human eye, radar. At first, it had seemed technical, secondary, perhaps useful, but not decisive. A machine, an instrument, something real, sailors could work around with skill, stealth, and nerve. But out here, in the night, radar was becoming more than a device. It was becoming presence, reach, warning, ambush. It was turning empty water into hostile space. That is where this story begins. Not with a blueprint in a laboratory, not with a patent or an engineering diagram, but with a bridge at night, a captain staring into darkness, and the dawning realization that the sea no longer felt empty because the enemy no longer needed to see with human eyes. So how did experienced Japanese captains, men trained for aggressive night combat and hardened by years of doctrine and war, before radar became something to fear, the Imperial Japanese Navy had reason to trust its own way of war? That matters, because history becomes shallow when it treats mistaken beliefs as foolish from the start. The men who led Japanese destroyers and cruisers into the dark waters of the Pacific were not amateurs wandering into modern war unprepared. They were officers shaped by one of the world's most professional naval traditions, steeped in discipline, technical competence, and a doctrine that took night battle with almost religious seriousness. In Japanese naval thought before and during the early years of the Pacific War, the decisive encounter still mattered. Fleets would maneuver, probe, weaken one another, and then, at the crucial moment, close in for destruction. Torpedoes, surprise, formation discipline, and aggression were not just tactical tools, they were expressions of belief. Belief that spirit could magnify skill, belief that training could offset material disadvantage, belief that an enemy stronger in industry could still be broken in battle if struck with precision and will. Night fighting fit naturally into that worldview. Darkness reduced visual clarity for everyone, but not equally. The side better trained to move, detect, and strike under those conditions could impose chaos on an opponent who was hesitant or poorly coordinated. Japanese officers studied night optics, formation handling, torpedo attack methods, and the hard psychological demands of commanding in conditions where hesitation could be fatal. They expected confusion in battle, but they also expected that confusion to favor the side most comfortable inside it. And in the early phases of the war, that confidence did not seem misplaced. Japanese night torpedo tactics could be devastating. Their famed Type 93 oxygen-fueled torpedo, what the Allies would come to know as the Long Lance, had range, speed, and striking power that could shock any opponent unlucky enough to wander into its path. Japanese ships often carried optics of high quality, and their crews were well drilled in night attack methods. In a close-range engagement under cover of darkness, many Japanese commanders believed they possessed not merely competence, but superiority. This shaped how they thought about the Americans. The United States Navy was respected, certainly. Its guns were powerful, its industrial base immense, its future capacity alarming. But power is one thing. Immediate battlefield advantage is another. A Japanese captain could fear heavy American shells in daylight and still believe that at night the balance could shift. After sunset, machinery alone could not be expected to win. Men still had to spot, interpret, decide, maneuver, and fire. A ship's crew still had to fight with discipline inside confusion. In that environment, Japanese doctrine suggested America's size would matter less. while Japan's training would matter more. And there was another reason this belief endured. Early American performance with radar did not immediately destroy it. The United States entered the Pacific War with promising radar technology, but technology on paper and combat performance at sea are never the same thing. Early radar sets had limitations. Operators needed experience. Commanders had to learn what the reports meant, when to trust them, and how to integrate them into decisions under pressure. Communication between combat information centers, bridges, gunnery officers, and task force commanders was not automatically smooth simply because a new machine existed somewhere in the ship. So, in the early months of the war, there were moments when radar was present but not fully exploited. Opportunities were missed. Contacts were misread. Commanders hesitated or failed to coordinate. This mattered enormously, because from the Japanese perspective, it reinforced a comforting conclusion. American radar might be useful, but it was not transforming the basic nature of night battle. It could aid a ship, perhaps. It did not appear to replace seamanship, courage, or aggressive doctrine. That assumption made sense inside the Japanese worldview. For generations, naval command had been bound to human judgment at the edge of uncertainty. Captains trusted lookouts, experience, and the rhythm of ship handling. A machine might extend awareness, but it still had to pass through fallible men. A screen in a compartment below decks could not, by itself, feel the wind, read the sea, or sense the enemy's intent. Many officers everywhere in the world initially saw radar this way, as an instrument that might support battle, not redefine it. But the deeper story of war is often the story of what happens when one side mistakes an emerging system for a mere accessory. Because America's radar advantage was never only about radar. It was about a navy learning, ship by ship and battle by battle, how to turn detection into action. A radar contact meant little if it could not be translated into intercept geometry, torpedo positioning, fire control, and timing. Yet that translation was exactly what American crews were beginning to master. The Japanese, meanwhile, were entering combat under the shadow of earlier success, and success can be dangerous when it hardens assumptions. If your doctrine has already given you victories, you are less likely to ask whether the environment itself is changing beneath your feet. Night combat had long been treated as an arena of human mastery. Lookouts straining into darkness, captains judging fleeting glimpses, destroyers cutting across black water to launch torpedoes before the enemy understood the trap. It was almost theatrical in its danger. But what if the stage itself had changed? What if one side no longer needed the same cues, the same uncertainty, the same mutual blindness? That question was not yet fully answered in the first phase of the war, which is why Japanese confidence endured. Night still felt familiar. Torpedoes still mattered. Aggression still worked. And so many officers continued to believe that if battle came after dark, they would meet it on terms they understood. This is the trap war lays for professionals. It rewards you just enough with yesterday's answers that you may not see tomorrow's question until it is too late. For Japanese captains, the old rule seemed clear. In darkness, the better sailor could still outfight the better factory. The Americans might build more ships, more guns, more ammunition. But the night sea was supposed to be something else. The most dangerous assumptions in war are rarely the loudest ones. They do not arrive announced by arrogance or stupidity. More often, they settle quietly into professional habit. They become the things experienced men no longer question because too much of their training, language, and identity depends on them remaining true. For many Japanese naval officers in the early Pacific War, one of those assumptions was this: a machine could aid the human eye, but it could not replace what skilled men saw, sensed, and judged in battle. That belief had a logic to it. Sea combat, especially at night, had always been an arena of imperfect information. Even in daylight, smoke, distance, weather, and maneuver could distort reality. After sunset, uncertainty multiplied. Bearings blurred. Ship silhouettes merged with cloud banks. Muzzle flashes deceived. Reports from lookouts came in fragments. Captains had to filter panic, instinct, and incomplete facts into life and death decisions within seconds. In that environment, sailors trusted men more than machines, because men, however flawed, were the traditional interpreters of war. Radar seemed different, useful, yes, interesting, certainly, but still dependent on maintenance, signal quality, trained operators, and commanders willing to bet their ships on information they could not see with their own eyes. You can understand why that mattered. A Japanese captain could accept that American radar might detect something at range and still believe the decisive encounter would ultimately belong to crews fighting visually. Once torpedoes were in the water and shells began landing, the old elements of battle would still take over: range, bearing, maneuver, nerve. In other words, radar might help begin a fight, but it would not overturn the character of the fight itself. And early war experience did not decisively prove otherwise. The Americans had radar, but at first they did not always know what to do with it. Some commanders did not fully trust reports from operators below decks. Some formations struggled to turn contact information into coordinated action. Some ships could detect the enemy, yet still fail to position effectively, launch on time, or open accurate fire soon enough. There were moments when radar produced awareness, but not advantage. To outside observers, that could make it look less like a revolution than a technical complication. For Japanese commanders watching the enemy, this may have been reassuring. The Americans were wealthy, powerful, and dangerous, but they still seemed bound by the same human frictions as everyone else. A machine that reported contacts was not the same as a crew that could exploit them. A screen could flicker with bearings, but it could not make officers bold, sharp, and synchronized. If American ships still hesitated in darkness, then perhaps radar was merely another piece of equipment helpful, yes, but secondary to the timeless elements of command. That was the fatal comfort. Because while Japanese officers were interpreting radar through the lens of old battle logic, American crews were slowly building a new one. The transformation did not happen all at once. It came through confusion, mistakes, awkward procedures, and hard-won lessons learned under fire. Operators learned to distinguish noise from contacts. Plotting rooms learned to update tracks continuously. Combat information centers learned how to feed bearings, ranges, and headings upward fast enough to matter. Gunnery teams learned to trust solutions built on electronic data. Captains learned that a contact unseen by the naked eye could still be real enough to destroy them if ignored. The key was not the machine alone, it was the integration. That is what Japanese commanders underestimated. Not radar as a box with wires and a rotating antenna, but radar as part of a system: operator, plotter, talker, gunnery officer, captain, maneuvering ship, firing solution. Once those elements began working together, American ships no longer had to wait for visual certainty before acting. They could build a picture of the night battle earlier, faster, and with less guesswork than an opponent still relying primarily on human sight. This changed more than detection range. It changed tempo. Night battles had traditionally been shaped by mutual uncertainty. Both sides moved through darkness, not knowing exactly where the other was, trying to seize initiative before they themselves were discovered. But when one side gains reliable early awareness, uncertainty stops being mutual. It becomes asymmetric. One commander is still searching, the other is already deciding. That is when fear begins to mutate. A captain can prepare himself to endure gunfire. He can train for torpedo attack. He can accept that battle brings explosions, confusion, and death. But being known before you know in return, that is harder to fight psychologically. It creates the sense that your decisions are lagging behind events. That you are responding to a battle the enemy began in silence minutes earlier. In practical terms, this could mean American destroyers maneuvering into torpedo position before Japanese ships realized they were under observation. It could mean cruisers opening fire with startling first salvo accuracy while remaining visually elusive. It could mean formations approaching in darkness with a hidden confidence that seemed unnatural to opponents still operating by traditional cues. Not omniscience, not perfection, but enough to bend the terms of battle. And once a few engagements began to reveal that pattern, the old assumptions started to crack. Not immediately. Professional habits do not die in one night. Captains still trusted their optics, their training, their doctrine. They still believed aggressive action could recover the initiative. In some battles it did. But with each encounter in which American ships seemed suspiciously well placed, suspiciously calm, suspiciously precise before visual contact, another sliver of doubt entered Japanese thinking. You can imagine those conversations afterward. On bridges, in wardrooms, in reports written under dim light after damage control parties finished pumping out flooded compartments. How had the enemy found them? Why had fire come so quickly? Why did the Americans seem ready for an attack that was supposed to rely on darkness and surprise? Was there an aircraft? A shadowing vessel? A signal betrayed? Or was the answer less dramatic and more disturbing? That the Americans had begun to trust a machine more than Japanese commanders believed any sensible sailor should. The ocean at night was no longer equally blind. And that is the heart of this story. The Japanese did not merely underestimate a technology, they underestimated the speed with which a determined navy could turn that technology into doctrine. They assumed radar would remain subordinate to the old rules long enough for those rules to keep working. They did not yet understand that the old rules were already being rewritten one engagement at a time. Soon, the proof would no longer come in theory. It would come as ghostly contacts on American screens. A weapon becomes truly dangerous when men learn to trust it under pressure. That was the real turning point for American naval radar in the Pacific. Not the moment a new set was bolted into a ship, not the first successful test, not even the first time it detected an enemy contact in darkness. The decisive shift came later, in the harder realm of combat practice, when operators, plotters, gunnery officers, and captains began acting on radar information fast enough and confidently enough to shape battle before visual contact ever occurred. To understand why Japanese captains began fearing radar more than guns, you have to see what radar became once it entered that world. Picture an American warship at night in the Solomon Islands. Above deck, the sea looks as blank and uncertain as it does from any bridge in the Pacific. Wind across the superstructure, warm spray, darkness broken only by the faintest glow of instrument lights and the occasional cigarette ember quickly hidden by a sailor who knows better. But below deck, inside the Combat Information Center, the night is no longer empty. Here, the battle begins as numbers and motion. A radar operator leans toward the scope, reading returns that would look meaningless to an untrained eye. A blip steadies, then shifts. Another appears beyond it. Range, bearing, relative movement. Talkers repeat data. Plotters mark courses. Officers compare the electronic picture against expected enemy routes and friendly dispositions. No one inside that cramped compartment can see the sea directly, and yet, in an important sense, they can see it more clearly than the men above. That is the revolution. Radar did not remove uncertainty, but it reorganized it. It gave the Americans a way to detect, track, and predict movement through darkness, smoke, and squalls with a consistency no human lookout could match. More importantly, it gave them time. Time to think before firing. Time to maneuver before being seen. Time to launch torpedoes from positions a purely visual battle might never have allowed. And time in naval combat is not just convenience, it is initiative. Once American ships began to treat radar contacts as operationally real rather than merely interesting, their behavior changed. Destroyers could swing outward to set ambush angles. Cruisers could adjust course to bring batteries into line. Gunnery officers could prepare solutions in advance, instead of waiting for searchlights or muzzle flashes to reveal the enemy. Captains could move with a confidence that felt eerie to opponents still trapped inside older patterns of uncertainty. That confidence had to be learned. At first, acting on radar required an almost unnatural leap of faith. Naval officers were trained to respect what could be confirmed visually. The eye, however imperfect, carried an authority instruments did not yet possess. To open fire based on unseen contacts, to maneuver aggressively toward a target no lookout could confirm, demanded not only technical competence but cultural change. It meant trusting the system, trusting the operator, trusting the plot, trusting that the battle below decks was real enough to guide the ship above. By the middle of the war, that trust was growing. American crews were not flawless. Equipment could fail. Reports could still be misread. Confusion remained part of combat. But the pattern had changed enough that radar no longer sat at the edge of decision-making. It was moving toward the center. The Americans were learning to fight through it, not merely with it. This distinction matters. A navy can possess advanced technology and still lose if its habits remain old. The Americans began closing that gap. Radar became tied to maneuver, torpedo doctrine, and fire control. It allowed ships to hold fire until the decisive moment, rather than revealing themselves early. It made surprise less dependent on eyesight and more dependent on information discipline. It let American commanders enter night action with something precious, an informed sense of where the enemy probably was, where he was turning, and where he would be by the time the first salvo was fired. To a Japanese captain, that could feel uncanny, because traditional night battle relied on tension shared by both sides. Both commanders were supposed to grope through darkness together, trying to seize an advantage inside mutual blindness. But radar corrupted that symmetry. One side still lived inside the old dark. The other had begun to map it. This is why the fear shifted from guns to radar. Guns remained the physical instrument of destruction. Shells still smashed steel, ignited fuel, shredded bodies, and sank ships. But radar was what made those guns arrive with such devastating timing. It was the invisible preparation behind visible violence. The silent prelude to the explosion. The reason the first salvos seemed to know exactly where to land. And there was another layer to the fear. A captain can face gunfire with defiance. He can order, return fire, turn into the attack, close the range, gamble on speed and aggression. Gunfire is terrifying, but it is legible. You see flashes. You hear reports. You know the enemy is there, and that knowledge, however dreadful, gives action a shape. Radar is different. Radar means the enemy may know you long before you know him. It turns the sea into a place where your ship can already be inside someone else's plan while your own bridge is still arguing over what the lookouts saw. That kind of exposure gnaws at command. It breeds late decisions. It makes every report feel suspect. It tempts captains to maneuver too soon or too late. It turns darkness from ally into uncertainty. A torpedo you can try to avoid. A salvo you can answer. But how do you answer being tracked by an enemy you cannot yet place? By the time many Japanese officers fully sensed what radar had become, the Americans were no longer simply experimenting with it. They were incorporating it into the rhythm of battle. That did not make them invincible. It did something more important. It changed the opening conditions of night action. Now a Japanese formation could be approaching with confidence, believing darkness still protected movement, while an American ship already held a developing picture of its course. Now an enemy could remain visually hidden yet tactically present. Now the first warning of contact might not be sight, but impact. This was the smaller turning point that changed the larger war. Not a single dramatic invention, not a cinematic unveiling, but a procedural evolution, a tightening of trust, a shift in doctrine. Radar stopped being an extra pair of eyes and became a method of hunting. It reached beyond weather and darkness. It allowed men to act before the old signals of battle appeared. It gave steel ships something close to anticipation. Soon, in the waters around Guadalcanal and beyond, Japanese captains would meet this new reality in the hardest way. There are many nights in the Pacific that could carry this story, but some matter more because they reveal the change not as theory, but as lived experience. One of them unfolded in the violent darkness around Guadalcanal, where the waters later called Ironbottom Sound became a graveyard for ships and assumptions alike. Here, among reefs, narrow channels, oppressive humidity, and the constant threat of air attack by day, night fighting became a brutal test of doctrine, nerve, and adaptation. It was exactly the kind of environment in which Japanese naval confidence had reason to flourish. The waters were dangerous, visibility uncertain, and battle often came at close range. If night still belonged to anyone, it should have belonged here. And yet it was here that the old balance began to break. Imagine a Japanese destroyer captain on a reinforcement run, or covering a larger movement through those waters. The mission is demanding but familiar. Speed, discipline, timing. Darkness is not merely concealment. It is part of the plan. The captain knows the Americans are nearby, but proximity is not itself a surprise. The entire region has become a machine of collision. What matters is who detects whom, who strikes first, and who keeps control once confusion begins. On the bridge, voices are clipped and professional. Bearings are repeated. A navigator checks position against shoreline assumptions barely visible in the dark. Lookouts. Watch for the signs that have always mattered. Mast shapes, searchlights, wakes, muzzle flashes. The captain trusts his crew because he has to. In night action, there is no room for theatrical panic. Fear must be compressed into discipline. Then, reports begin to arrive that do not fit the expected pattern. A possible contact, no visual confirmation. Another report from a different bearing. Still, nothing definite. The captain delays a decisive turn because false alarms at night can be as dangerous as real ones. Nearby friendly ships are also maneuvering. Signal confusion lurks in every hesitation. The ocean seems full of possibility, but empty of certainty. And on an American ship not far away, certainty is taking shape. Down below in the Combat Information Center, operators have already begun to track the Japanese approach. Bearings hold, range closes, plotters sketch motion across the board. Above them, the bridge waits not for the visible shock of encounter, but for the right moment to act. Torpedoes can be readied, gunnery solutions refined, formation adjustments made with deliberate restraint. The Americans are not omniscient. They are not beyond error, but they are inside the battle sooner. That difference is everything. Back on the Japanese bridge, the first shells arrive before the emotional rhythm of battle has had time to form. There is no searchlight challenge, no long visual buildup, no reassuring sequence in which both sides gradually discover one another and exchange violence inside mutual awareness. Instead, the enemy seems to materialize through fire. Water erupts near the bows, a shell crashes somewhere aft, orders crack through the bridge. Turn, report damage, find the enemy. But find the enemy is now the most desperate instruction of all, because the enemy has already solved the opposite problem. For the captain, seconds become distorted. He tries to reconstruct the geometry. Where are the Americans? How many? Are these destroyers? Cruisers? Have they crossed ahead? Is there another force still unseen? Were aircraft involved? Is his own line still intact? At night, battle is partly violence and partly interpretation. If interpretation collapses, violence accelerates. Then comes the deeper shock. The Americans are firing as though they can see. Not perfectly, not magically, but with a steadiness that feels unnatural in darkness. Salvos correct quickly. Their ships maneuver without the clumsy hesitation one expects from an opponent guessing at shadows. If torpedoes enter the water, they seem to come from logical ambush points rather than desperate reactions. The entire enemy force carries an unnerving sense of coherence. This is where radar ceases to be an abstract explanation and becomes psychological fact. The captain may not know exactly what the Americans see on their scopes. He may never hear the words Combat Information Center or understand the full procedural chain translating a radar return into a firing solution. But he can feel the result. He can feel that the old darkness is not protecting him equally. He can feel that he is being engaged by an opponent who entered the battle earlier than he did. Around Guadalcanal, that sensation became increasingly familiar. In actions like Cape Esperance, Tassafaronga, and the larger sequence of desperate naval clashes tied to the struggle for the island, both sides inflicted pain and suffered terribly. The Japanese remained dangerous, often lethally so. American radar did not erase Japanese skill, nor did it automatically guarantee victory in every encounter. But the pattern was changing. When American commanders used radar well, They could spring action from hidden awareness. When they used it poorly, opportunities were squandered. The distinction itself reveals the point. Radar had become central enough that its proper use could alter the battle's opening geometry. For Japanese officers, this created a new burden of command. Every night action now carried an invisible question. Does the enemy already have us? Not, can he see us? In the old optical sense. But something colder. Does he already know our bearing, our approximate range, our approach line? Are we moving through darkness or through a net we cannot perceive? You can imagine the strain afterward. A damaged ship limping away in darkness. Men burned in compartments below. Signalmen dead at their stations. Splintered metal, severed lines. The smell of hot oil and cordite thick in the passageways. On the bridge, surviving officers trying to write reports that impose order on bewilderment. They can describe shell hits, course changes, torpedo tracks, confusion in formation. But how do you write the creeping realization that the enemy's greatest weapon was not the shell that landed, but the invisible awareness that made it land first? And once that realization enters a professional navy, it spreads. Not as theatrical panic, not as superstition, but as a quiet recalculation in the minds of captains who still have to lead men into the next night. Routes are reconsidered, assumptions soften. Confidence becomes edged with suspicion. Darkness, once a field of action, starts to feel like a field of exposure. One night at Guadalcanal did not decide everything, but it gave the transformation a human face. A captain on a bridge, a force slipping into disorder. American voices below deck calmly calling out bearings no Japanese lookout could match. The shell fire was real. The torpedoes were real. The deaths were real. But behind all of them stood something less visible and, in its own way, more frightening. The enemy had begun to fight the fear becomes strategy when it changes how commanders behave before the battle begins. That is what happened as American radar-guided fighting matured in the Pacific. At first, Japanese captains encountered it as an unsettling battlefield advantage. Then, over time, it began to alter movement, timing, doctrine, and expectation across a wider operational space. Radar was no longer merely part of an American ship. It was becoming part of an American way of war at night. The cumulative effect was corrosive. Japanese naval officers had once treated darkness as a medium in which skill could compensate for industrial inferiority. At night, a smaller but better prepared force could still impose surprise, launch decisive torpedo attacks, and fight on terms less dominated by sheer mass. But as American radar improved, and American crews learned to exploit it more consistently, darkness started to lose that equalizing power. A reinforcement run through contested waters no longer meant only worrying about visual detection, aircraft, or random collision with enemy ships. It now meant wondering whether an unseen American force had already picked up the formation electronically and was positioning for attack long before any Japanese lookout could confirm danger. That uncertainty changed tempo. Ships could still move at night, but the confidence beneath those movements began to thin. This mattered especially in the grinding struggle around the Solomons, where reinforcement, resupply, and repeated naval clashes placed enormous strain on both sides. Japanese destroyers running troops and supplies down the slot were performing missions that demanded timing, stealth, and composure. Night had been their ally. But if American ships could use radar to predict routes and intercept in darkness, then every such mission became more hazardous in a new way. Even when no battle occurred, the possibility of being tracked without warning altered the psychological landscape. Commanders react to that by becoming more cautious, more tense, more prone to second-guessing. Caution is not cowardice. In war, it is often the reasonable response to a changing threat. But caution has consequences. It can delay action. It can complicate formations. It can make captains less willing to commit to aggressive night maneuvers that once seemed natural. It can also create a kind of internal friction, where officers still believe in the old doctrine but no longer feel entirely protected by it. That gap between belief and feeling is where strategic anxiety grows, and radar fed that anxiety, because it seemed to announce a broader truth about the Americans. The Japanese were not just facing an enemy with a useful device. They were facing an enemy capable of learning at scale. A navy that could absorb losses, study mistakes, rotate crews, improve procedures, repair ships, produce better equipment, and return to battle with growing competence. Radar was one expression of that larger machine. Dangerous in itself, yes, but more dangerous because it was embedded inside an industrial and organizational culture increasingly good at turning lessons into repeatable advantage. That realization can be crushing. A captain can adjust to one new enemy tactic. He can study one weapon. He can revise one set of expectations. But how does he respond when the true threat is adaptation itself? When each encounter suggests that the enemy you faced last month is not quite the enemy you are facing now, this is where radar's meaning expands beyond the immediate duel. It begins to influence supply decisions, escort patterns, route planning, and the willingness to risk ships in constricted waters. Japanese commanders did not stop fighting at night. They could not. Operational necessity forced continued movement and continued battle. But necessity under suspicion is different from necessity under confidence. When darkness no longer feels like shelter, every night operation carries the extra weight of possible invisible exposure. And the Americans, importantly, were no longer using radar in isolation. It worked alongside growing tactical sophistication, improved communications, and the immense logistical depth of a navy able to sustain experimentation under fire. A radar contact became part of a larger system of action, not always elegant, not always successful, but increasingly dangerous because it was connected to ships, crews, ammunition stocks, maintenance networks, and command habits that were all trending toward greater coherence. Japanese officers sensed this even if they did not always describe it in those terms. They could see that American night fighting was changing, that enemy ships were less blind than expected, that first salvos arrived faster, that approaches once thought stealthy now carried hidden risk, that a battle begun in darkness could suddenly feel as though the Americans had opened it from behind a curtain. Over time, this chips away at more than tactics. It chips away at identity. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built much of its confidence on professionalism, aggression, and the belief that superior training could shape decisive outcomes. If night battle, the very arena where these qualities seemed most potent, was becoming less reliable as a field of advantage, then part of the institution's emotional foundation was being challenged. Not erased, but challenged. Captains could still be brave, crews could still be disciplined, torpedoes could still kill, yet the terms on which those strengths mattered were shifting. That shift is what makes radar such a powerful historical symbol. It was not simply a better tool. It represented a war moving away from the old romance of mutual uncertainty and towards something more systematized, more procedural, more industrial in its relationship to knowledge. The side that could gather, distribute, trust, and exploit information fastest gained a form of initiative that raw courage could not easily cancel. For Japanese commanders, the fear of radar therefore became a fear of transformation itself. Not because radar made them helpless in every encounter, it did not, but because it signaled that the war was changing in favor of the side better able to fuse technology, training, and doctrine. The night sea, once imagined as a theater for audacity and surprise, was becoming a place where audacity could run straight into unseen calculation. And this had a cost that statistics alone cannot capture. Every time a captain led men into those waters, he carried not only mission orders but accumulated memory. Memory of contacts appearing too late. Memory of salvos arriving from darkness with unsettling precision. Memory of reports that never resolved into visual certainty before damage was done. Memory of seeing the enemy grow more dangerous in the very environment once thought to favor Japanese skill. That memory traveled with ships from one operation to the next. It sat beside charts. It shaped posture on bridges. It entered the pauses before orders were given. What began as tactical surprise had matured into strategic anxiety. And beneath that anxiety lay the hardest truth of all. War was no longer just about who had the sharper eyes, the stronger nerve. There is a particular loneliness in naval command at night. It is not the loneliness of being physically alone. A warship is crowded with men, voices, machinery, and constant motion. Orders move through speaking tubes, telephones, shouted relays, and the routines of drilled procedure. Yet for the captain on the bridge, especially in darkness, command can feel terribly solitary. The reports that reach him are always incomplete. The horizon tells him almost nothing. He makes decisions for hundreds of men with only fragments, instinct, and the pressure of seconds. Radar changed that loneliness, but not by relieving it. In some ways, it deepened it for the side that did not control it. Before radar became decisive, fear in night battle had a certain familiarity. Sailors feared torpedoes, shell fire, collision, fire in enclosed compartments, the sudden listing of a ship after a hit below the waterline. These were known horrors. They were violent, chaotic, and often unavoidable, but they belonged to the physical grammar of war. Men could imagine them, train for them, and tell themselves that skill, luck, or courage might meet them on equal terms. Radar introduced a subtler dread. Now a ship could be under threat before anyone above deck sensed a visible enemy. Men still died by steel and flame, but the moments before death were altered. A sailor at a gun mount might stare into blackness, waiting for the first sign of battle, not realizing the enemy had already built a firing solution. A destroyer captain might order a course change based on uncertain lookout reports, while an American plotting room calmly tracked that maneuver on a glowing scope. The old sensation of mutual blindness that both sides were equally groping through danger began to dissolve. That has psychological consequences, because courage works best when danger has a shape. When men know what they are facing, even imperfectly, they can brace against it. They can focus on tasks. They can return fire. They can believe their actions still meet the enemy in some visible contest. But when the danger begins with exposure rather than sight, when the enemy seems to know before revealing himself, fear becomes more inward, more anticipatory, more corrosive. Imagine the men below decks. Boiler rooms hot enough to exhaust the body even before battle begins. Engine compartments vibrating with constant force. Damage control. Parties standing by with hoses, tools, and grim understanding. Torpedo crews waiting for launch orders that may come too late. In every compartment there is routine, but also tension. Everyone knows night action can erupt without warning, yet the warning itself is changing. Instead of the dramatic visual cue of contact, the first sign may be the shudder of impact, the scream of metal, the sudden loss of power, the lights flickering as the ship is struck by an enemy that felt absent a second earlier. This is why the fear of radar was not exaggerated or symbolic. It was intimate. It altered the emotional texture of waiting. A captain on the bridge now had to wonder whether his unease was justified by unseen reality. Were those ambiguous reports merely nerves, or had the enemy already found him? Were the Americans out there searching blindly like everyone else, or had they already begun to close the trap? Every pause could feel loaded. Every dark horizon could conceal not just ships, but knowledge. And as losses mounted across the Pacific, that uncertainty became inseparable from grief. Ships burned at night with a terrible beauty. Muzzle flashes strobing across water, fuel fires reflecting on low cloud, men thrown into black sea lit only by distant gunfire. Those who survived often carried memories not only of violence, but of bewilderment of battle beginning before comprehension, of commands issued into confusion, of the feeling that the enemy had somehow arrived ahead of the visible war. For Japanese naval officers, this was especially painful because it struck at the dignity of their professional identity. These were not men who imagined themselves passive victims of technology. They believed in training, precision, aggression, and composure under pressure. Many fought with extraordinary courage, even as the balance turned against them. But courage in itself cannot restore a battlefield that has changed structure. You can be brave inside a collapsing doctrine. You can be disciplined inside an outdated assumption. You can die honorably in a fight whose terms no longer favor the strengths you spent your life mastering. That is one of war's cruelest truths. The victims of military change are often not the incompetent, but the highly trained men who realize too late that the environment around their skills has shifted. Japanese captains did not suddenly become lesser sailors because American radar improved. Their optics did not stop being sharp. Their torpedoes did not stop being deadly. Their crews did not stop suffering or sacrificing. What changed was the battlefield's relationship to information, and once that changed, many of their strengths had to operate under new disadvantages. This is the deeper human cost hidden beneath technical history. When people hear radar, they may think of equipment, engineering, range tables, and electronics. But for the men in the ships, radar meant something far more personal. It meant that darkness could betray them. It meant that the sea, once vast and concealing, had become penetrable in ways their instincts could not fully answer. It meant that command decisions now carried the burden of an enemy's invisible awareness. And that burden could be exhausting. Think of the captain after battle, long after the firing stops. He remains on the bridge or in a dim compartment, writing reports while the ship limps away or while survivors are counted and the dead identified. He must translate chaos into sentences: contact at such and such bearing, opened fire at such and such range, enemy not visually confirmed until after first salvo, torpedo tracks observed. Damage severe, casualties heavy. These are formal phrases, but behind them lies a more private reckoning. The enemy fought the night differently, and the old confidence no longer holds. That recognition does not always come dramatically. Sometimes it comes as a slow erosion. A little more tension before the next night run. A little less faith in concealment. A little more suspicion that somewhere beyond the dark, the Americans are already watching. Many wars turn on firepower, many turn on production, but some turn on perception. On which side understands first that the rules have changed and which side continues, for a little too long, to fight as though the old world still exists. By the time many Japanese captains fully felt the human meaning of radar, it was not just a device on enemy ships. It was a message from the future of naval warfare. And the message was cruel. Courage still mattered. Discipline still mattered. Sacrifice still mattered. But so what did they believe? They believed that darkness still belonged to the better sailor. They believed that training, optics, formation discipline, and aggressive torpedo doctrine could offset America's greater industrial weight. They believed that at night, the war at sea could still be forced into something intimate and human, a contest of nerve, skill, timing, and boldness, rather than a pure test of production. They believed that if battle came after sunset, the side more comfortable inside confusion might still seize the advantage. And for a time, there was truth in that belief. Japanese naval officers entered the Pacific War with real strengths. Their destroyer tactics were formidable. Their torpedoes were among the most dangerous in the world. Their professionalism was not imagined. Their doctrine was not fantasy. This is important to remember, because history means more when it recognizes that strong institutions can still fail, not because their strengths were fake, but because war changed faster than their assumptions. What really happened was more unsettling. America did not merely bring bigger guns to sea. It learned, imperfectly at first, and then with growing competence, how to combine technology with procedure, training, and decision-making in a way that changed the character of night battle. Radar was not magic. It did not remove uncertainty, nor did it win the Pacific by itself. Men still had to interpret signals, make choices, maneuver ships, fire weapons, and endure the terrible randomness of combat. But once the Americans learned to trust radar enough to act through it, the night sea ceased to be neutral ground. That was the transformation. The darkness remained physically the same. The water was still black. The clouds still hid stars. The tropical air still clung to skin. Muzzle flashes still tore open the night with sudden violence. Torpedoes still ran cold and deadly beneath the surface. But the invisible structure of battle had changed. One side was increasingly able to detect, track, and prepare before visual contact. The other was still fighting too often inside the older grammar of mutual uncertainty. In that sense, radar did more than improve targeting. It rearranged fear. American guns remained lethal, of course. They smashed hulls, ignited ammunition, tore through crews, and sent ships to the bottom. Yet guns were only the visible end of a longer process. Behind the shell that landed first was often an unseen chain of awareness. A contact on a screen, a plotted bearing, a maneuver made with confidence, a firing solution prepared in darkness. Japanese captains were not irrational when they came to dread that chain more than the shell itself. The shell was the blow. Radar was the hand guiding it through the night. And with that came a larger lesson about the war. World War II was full of moments when one side believed courage, tradition, or tactical habit could hold back a changing battlefield. Sometimes those beliefs survived longer than they should have because they were built on real past success. But success in one version of war can become a trap in the next. The Pacific at night became one of those places where yesterday's excellence met tomorrow's system. You can return now to the image that opened this story. A Japanese captain on a bridge at night, scanning water that looks empty and is not. Around him, the machinery hums, officers wait, lookouts search, and doctrine still speaks in the language of decisive action. Somewhere beyond sight, an American ship has already begun to form a picture of his position. Nothing visible has yet happened. No searchlight, no broadside, no exploding shell. And yet, in the most important sense, the battle has already started. That is the tragedy. Not simply that men died. Naval war had always meant that men would die. The tragedy is that many of those men were still relying, bravely and professionally, on a battlefield reality that no longer fully existed. They carried into the night the skills and beliefs of one era while the enemy was learning to fight in another. The sea remembers none of this. It closes over wrecks. It swallows flame, steel, bodies, and sound. But history remembers because these moments reveal something larger than naval technology. They reveal how war punishes delayed understanding, how fear is reshaped when the enemy sees first, how invisible advantages become visible only in the violence they produce. This is why the story matters, beyond the Pacific. Because every generation of war has its version of the same collision. What experienced men believe the battlefield still is, and what it has quietly become. By the time the difference is obvious, ships may already be burning. In the end, Japanese captains did not fear radar because it was dramatic. They feared it because it was patient, because it could sit beyond sight and still turn the night against them, because it made darkness less protective, surprise less reliable, and courage less sufficient by itself, because it exposed the cruelest reality of modern war. The enemy who understands first often strikes